This last one is going to be tough. Especially, it was tough for me when I first learned it. Let me put it that way. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me on this last one, because we've already said two things. God's wrath is certain. We agree. God's wrath is just. On that we agree. Thirdly, and what will be most controversial and may even cause some conversations, which I love, God's wrath is proportionate. Write that down. God's wrath is proportionate. A person's continual sinful actions can store up more and more wrath against them for the day of wrath. This verse tells us that that is so. Look again at verse 5. Because of your hard and impenitent heart, you are storing up wrath. That word, storing up, comes from the Greek word thesaurus. Where does that word? What does that word sound like? Thesaurus. What does the word thesaurus mean? Treasury. We use it for the book. It's a treasury of words, right? That's what a thesaurus is. Well, the Greek word thesaurus means they're treasuring it, they're storing it, they're building it up. Okay? And I remember the first time I heard the concept of someone building up wrath against themselves, I didn't really understand it, because I felt like one sin is the same as 50 sins. I felt like, well, you know, that's kind of, and I thought about James 2:10. James 2:10 came to my mind, probably came to your mind. When James 2:10 says, for whoever keeps the whole law fails in one point, has become accountable for all of it. Or, you know, and you think about that, well then that means it's not proportionate. No, that's not what that means. That means that when we sin, we become sinners. And no one is not a sinner. If you break the law in one place, just because you're not a murderer, if you're just an adulterer, you can't say you're better than the murderer, because you're still a sinner. Okay? That's what James is saying. But what we see also scripturally is this. The Bible describes judgment as having the capacity to be worse for some than others. Isn't that weird? But it's true. I want to take you somewhere real quick. Go to Matthew 11, because if you don't believe me, believe Jesus. Jesus always tells the truth, right? So does Paul too, and all the rest of them, because they are under the inspiration of the Spirit right here. But in Matthew 11:20, there's a very important verse. Matthew 11:20. It says, then he began to denounce the cities where most of his mighty works had been done, because they did not repent. Jesus is the one who's doing the denouncing. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for Tyre and Sidon than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? You will be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Sodom, and you all know what Sodom was. Sodom was that wicked city where the fire fell from the sky. If the works that I did in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until now. But I tell you that it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom than for you. Have you ever considered the fact that while all people who reject Christ will be punished in judgment, there will be some whose punishment is even more intolerable? I know that sounds strange, but there's really no other way to take it. He says while both are being punished, there's going to be one whose punishment is even less tolerable than the other. And maybe this is what it is. Maybe it's just the fact that that one city didn't know, and they're being punished. And this city knew, and they're going to have to look back for eternity at the opportunity of having seen Jesus and know they rejected Him. I want to read to you from Dr. John MacArthur on his comments on this particular statement. He says, at the great white throne judgment, the dead of all the ages will be brought before the throne of God and will be judged and sentenced to eternal punishment. And at that judgment, the unbelieving Gentiles of Tyre and Sidon will fare better than the unbelieving Jews of Chorazin and Bethsaida. Jesus here makes two truths clear. There will be degrees of punishment in hell, and among those given the severest punishment will be those who received the divine revelation and been the most religious and outwardly upright. Those who thought they were eternally safe because they were Abraham's physical descendants and because they kept the religious traditions of their forefathers looked with contempt on the Gentiles, yet in hell many Gentiles will look down at them. He goes on to say, the hottest places belong to those who have rejected the most light. Listen to Jesus' own words from Luke 12:47. He says, the slave who knew his master's will and did not get ready or act in accord with his will shall receive many lashes, but the one who did not know it and committed deeds worthy of flogging will receive but a few. And for everyone who has been given much shall much be required, and to whom they entrusted much, of him they will ask all the more. The Lord's talking about judgment, and His point is simple. The greater the light, the greater the accountability. The greater the light, the greater they're going to look back into eternity knowing. And this is what scares me, folks, is, people ask me, do you think a person out in Africa who's never heard about Jesus, if they die having not received Jesus, will that person be punished? I say they have to be if they're a sinner, and I've never met a person who's not a sinner. Okay? I mean, that's why we send missionaries to go and tell these people about Jesus. Why send missionaries? If they're going to get out of it, having never heard, then we should pull all the missionaries back home. Think of it. Really be logical for a moment. If they're not, if they don't hear about Jesus means they go straight to heaven, then we should just bring the missionaries back home and make sure they don't hear. Turn off the radios. Bring Billy Graham home. Do you get what I'm saying? We go after them because we believe that God's people are in every nation, tribe, and tongue, and we go seeking them out. But we know this, that just because somebody didn't hear about Jesus doesn't mean that they get a freebie on Judgment Day, because they're still sinners. But here's what is scary. The person who sits in church for 50 years thinking they know Jesus and they reject Him in their lives and reject Him in their heart will be punished all the more because they had that much time having heard the gospel and they rejected it. That's the scary part. Have I run off and left you? I sure hope not. This is heavy stuff. I'm losing my breath. This is heavy stuff, though, seriously. Because this is the scary part, is the people who sit in church and they reject Christ have rejected the light that God has shown them. And as I've noted, those who reject light the most will be the ones who are punished the worst. The one who knew the will of the Master and did it not received the harder lashing than the one who just didn't know the will and still did wrong. When this verse tells us they are storing up wrath for themselves on the day of wrath, I want you to think of it like this. There was once a man who built up a great hoard of gold coins, and he kept them in a sack over his bed. And every time he'd get gold coins, he'd come home and he'd put them in his attic right over his bed. He would fill the sack with gold coins until one night the weight of the coins was too heavy for the ceiling and it crashed down upon him and killed him. This is what is happening with the sins. They are building up like a dam waiting to burst. And if they do not receive Christ on the day of judgment, that dam of wrath will burst and will crush them to dust. Ultimately, I've heard it said, if you slip into sin, you might as well go full bore because, hey, you did it once, it's not going to hurt if you do it 50 times. Let me tell you something, that is not true. If you find yourself slipping into sin, don't just go full bore. repent, which means turn and go the other way. We have seen tonight that God's wrath is certain, God's wrath is just, and God's wrath is proportionate.